The inspection log was complete, but the camera timestamp lagged by 6 minutes. The Royal Guard noticed it while checking the nursery corridor. A child stood quietly by the window, collar slightly turned. When the guard knelt to adjust it, faint linear marks appeared beneath the fabric, too precise to be accidental. He paused, listening to the building settle. The corridor felt unusually still. Something had already gone wrong. The corridor outside the nursery wing carried a cooler draft than the rest of the floor, a subtle difference that registered with the Royal Guard as he moved at a measured pace, boots silent against the polished stone. Morning inspections were designed to be unremarkable, and most were, a steady ritual of checks that reinforced the illusion of order the palace depended on. He scanned door seals, tested hinges, noted the position of wall-mounted cameras without looking directly at them. Halfway down the corridor, he slowed. One of the service doors stood ajar by no more than a hand's width, its latch disengaged. It was a small thing, easily dismissed as oversight by housekeeping, but it did not belong. He stopped, listening. The palace was awake but muted at this hour. Distant footsteps softened by heavy walls, the faint hum of ventilation passing through ducts overhead. He closed the door, securing it, and logged the irregularity on his handheld device. The timestamp flashed, then hesitated before updating. He frowned, scrolling back through the overnight record. A 6-minute gap appeared in the camera feed outside the nursery, a clean interruption without system error notation. That, too, did not belong. He resumed walking, posture unchanged, though his attention sharpened, every sense calibrated to detail. Inside the nursery, light filtered through tall windows, pale and cold. A child stood near the glass, small hands resting against the frame, eyes fixed on the gardens below. No nurse was present. The guard paused at the threshold, noting the absence before stepping inside. He greeted the child quietly, his voice level, and approached under the pretext of adjusting a collar that sat unevenly against the neck. When his fingers brushed the fabric, the child flinched, a reflexive movement, quick and controlled. The guard eased back slightly, then gently corrected the collar. As the fabric shifted, faint linear marks surfaced along the skin, narrow and parallel, fading but unmistakable. He did not react outwardly. He straightened, offered a neutral remark about the morning schedule, and moved toward the observation desk where the overnight logbook lay open. Entries were neat, uniform, signed by staff whose routines he knew well. Nothing was missing, yet the sense of absence persisted. He checked the window locks, then the internal alarm panel, each responding as expected. Behind him, the child remained silent. The guard felt the weight of the moment settle, not as panic, but as gravity. He had been trained to trust procedure, to catalog anomalies without interpretation, but the combination of details pressed against that discipline. A door ajar, a camera feed interrupted, marks where there should be none. He glanced once more at the child, who had turned away from the window now, shoulders slightly hunched. The guard closed the logbook, noting the time again, and stepped back into the corridor, his expression unchanged, but his pace slower, more deliberate. He understood that whatever had occurred had been designed to leave no obvious trace, and that addressing it would require restraint before action. He moved toward the security office, aware that the next decision would define how much he was willing to see. The security office was dimmer than the corridors, its lights calibrated to screens rather than people, and the Royal Guard took his place at the terminal without drawing attention. He reviewed the camera interruption frame by frame, confirming what he already suspected. No system fault, no scheduled maintenance, just a clean loss of visual record.
He cross-referenced the time with access logs for the nursery wing, noting entries that aligned with authorized movement, all routine, all expected. It would have been easy to close the file there, to mark the discrepancy for technical follow-up and move on, but the image of the child's flinch lingered. He opened a restricted note, the kind used sparingly, and recorded his observations with precision, avoiding inference. Marks observed, child reaction noted, camera gap documented. He saved the entry under his clearance, aware that doing so created a trace that could not be erased casually. Leaving the office, he encountered a senior supervisor near the stairwell, a man whose authority rested on years of service rather than rank alone. They exchanged brief acknowledgments. The supervisor mentioned a scheduled briefing, nothing urgent, his tone neutral. The guard responded in kind, withholding the weight of what he had seen. Protocol dictated confirmation before escalation, and confirmation required medical review. He requested a discreet wellness check through internal channels, framing it as precautionary. The response came back measured, delayed, suggesting observation before involvement. The guard accepted the answer outwardly, yet noted the reluctance. Returning to the nursery wing, he positioned himself nearby under routine assignment, maintaining visibility without intrusion. Staff moved in and out, their behavior unchanged, their routines intact. The child did not reappear. Hours passed with the slow elasticity unique to guarded spaces, where time seemed to stretch around vigilance. Midday light warmed the corridor slightly, dust motes visible when the sun struck at an angle. A nurse emerged briefly, then retreated, offering a polite nod that revealed nothing. The guard checked his device again, confirming that his note remained unaltered. He felt the pressure begin to build, not from overt command, but from the silence surrounding his request. Authority within the palace often expressed itself through delay, through the expectation that concerns would fade if left unattended. He adjusted his stance, attentive to footsteps, voices, any deviation. When a message finally arrived authorizing a medical assessment, it carried conditions, limited scope, confidentiality emphasized. He acknowledged receipt without comment. As evening approached, the corridor cooled again, shadows lengthening along the walls. The guard remained at his post, aware that once the assessment occurred, the matter would move beyond quiet observation into consequence. He understood that the system would resist disruption, and that resistance would not announce itself openly. Standing there, listening to the subdued rhythm of the palace, he recognized that his role had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, from observer to custodian of something fragile, and that the routine inspection had already ended. The medical suite occupied a discreet corner of the palace, removed from ceremonial routes and public corridors, and the royal guard stood outside its frosted doors as the assessment began, posture neutral, hands loosely clasped behind his back. The physician had arrived without announcement, escorted by administrative staff rather than security, an arrangement that spoke to the sensitivity of the visit. No explanations were offered aloud. Inside, voices remained low, indistinct, the air carrying the faint antiseptic scent that seeped into the hall. The guard focused on the ambient details instead, the soft tick of a wall clock, the steady hum of climate control, the muted echo of footsteps passing beyond the wing. When the door opened briefly to allow equipment inside, he caught a glimpse of the child seated on the examination table, feet not quite touching the floor, gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The marks were not visible from this distance, but the child's shoulders were rigid, arms held close to the body as if conserving warmth. The examination concluded without ceremony. The physician exited first, expression composed, eyes meeting the guards only for a moment before shifting away. A report would follow, he said, his voice careful, and the door closed again. The guard returned to his station, logging the time, noting who had entered and who had not. Hours later, the report arrived through encrypted channels, its language clinical and restrained. The injuries were consistent with external pressure, non-accidental, timing uncertain. No conclusions were drawn beyond that. The guard read it twice, then filed it under the restricted entry he had already created, linking the documents with deliberate precision. He requested guidance from his immediate superior, attaching the report without commentary. The response came after a delay, instructing him to maintain observation and refrain from further action until review by senior staff. The phrasing was courteous, firm, and unmistakably final. That evening he attended the briefing as scheduled, standing among colleagues as routine updates were delivered. No mention was made of the nursery wing, of medical assessments, of camera interruptions. When the meeting concluded, a senior administrator approached him privately, tone cordial, reminding him of the importance of discretion in matters involving family privacy. The guard listened, nodded once, and offered no argument. Returning to his quarters, he reviewed the access logs again, noting that certain entries lacked secondary verification. It was a minor procedural lapse, common enough to escape notice, but in context it carried weight. He documented it, knowing it would be seen as persistence rather than diligence. The palace settled into night, its rhythm slower, quieter. As he resumed his post near the nursery wing, he felt the subtle pressure of expectation, the unspoken hope that the matter would resolve itself into silence. Silence, however, proved heavier than noise. Over the following days, the Royal Guard observed a careful narrowing of access around the nursery wing, justified as routine adjustments, but executed with unusual specificity. Staff rotations changed without explanation, and certain names appeared more frequently in the logs, others not at all. When he raised a procedural question about verification gaps, the reply was courteous but dismissive, suggesting clerical error. He accepted the answer outwardly, yet continued to document, aware that accumulation itself could become a liability. The child remained largely unseen, escorted through back corridors when movement was necessary, always accompanied by staff rather than security. The guard noted this deviation, understanding its implications. He encountered his supervisor again near the end of the week, this time summoned rather than coincidental. In a small office overlooking an inner courtyard, he was reminded of the chain of command, of the importance of restraint, of the risks inherent in misinterpretation. The supervisor's tone was measured, almost sympathetic, but the message was clear. Further escalation without explicit authorization would be viewed as breach. The guard acknowledged the guidance, feeling the narrowing margin between duty and obedience. That night, he reviewed the medical report once more, then compared it with historical incident files, searching for pattern without assumption. He found none that matched precisely, only echoes of cases resolved quietly, their conclusions sealed. The realization did not provoke anger, only resolve. He prepared a supplemental note, factual, concise, outlining the convergence of discrepancies without accusation. Before submitting it, he hesitated, aware that so doing would place his actions beyond plausible deniability. He submitted it anyway. The response was swift this time, summoning him to a senior review panel. The meeting was formal, attended by figures whose authority rested in tradition as much as role. Questions were asked, answers given, all within the boundaries of professionalism. No one disputed the facts. They debated interpretation. In the end, he was instructed to stand down from the matter, reassigned temporarily to another wing. The decision was framed as precautionary, not punitive. As he left the chamber, he understood that the reassignment was designed to remove proximity, to dissolve momentum. Yet the records remained, immutable once filed. Returning to his new post, you watched the palace continue its functions uninterrupted, ceremonies rehearsed, schedules maintained. The child's wing lay out of sight, but not out of mind. The guard recognized that protocol did what it was designed to do, contain uncertainty. Whether that containment protected the vulnerable or the institution remained unanswered, and the weight of that question followed him into the quiet hours, unresolved but sharpened, awaiting the moment when silence would no longer suffice.
The reassignment placed the royal guard in a quieter wing of the palace, one dominated by administrative offices and storage corridors, where vigilance was expected but rarely tested. The distance from the nursery wing was intentional, yet it afforded him access to archival systems under the guise of routine oversight. He worked methodically, reviewing historical access logs and cross-referencing them with maintenance schedules, staff rotations, and security overrides, looking not for proof, but for coherence. What emerged instead was a pattern of absence. Certain entries lacked corroborating signatures, a deviation subtle enough to be dismissed individually, but persistent across weeks. He noted that these gaps aligned with periods when surveillance interruptions had occurred elsewhere in the palace, never triggering alarms, never followed by investigation. Late evenings became his window for review, when offices emptied and the hum of servers replaced conversation. He adjusted to the rhythm, documenting findings in neutral language, careful not to assign motive. The medical report remained central, its clinical certainty standing in contrast to the administrative ambiguity surrounding it. He requested anonymized data from the infirmary, framing the request as audit preparation, and compared injury classifications across cases. The child's marks stood apart, not in severity, but in precision, inconsistent with accidental injury profiles. As he compiled this information, he became aware of subtle resistance, delayed responses, missing files, permissions that required escalation. None were refusals, but together they formed a barrier. One evening, while reviewing corridor footage from a secondary archive, he noticed a figure entering the nursery wing during the camera gap he had first observed. The image was partial, resolution degraded, but the access badge registered clearly, assigned to an individual whose authorization did not include that area. He isolated the clip, preserving it in a secure partition. The absence of accompanying audio heightened its significance. He verified the badge assignment against personnel records, confirming the discrepancy. This was no longer an anomaly, but evidence of unauthorized presence. He paused, considering the implications. To proceed required formal escalation, yet his prior experience suggested such action would trigger containment rather than response. He opted instead to expand the dataset, reviewing adjacent days, discovering similar unauthorized entries masked by procedural oversights. Each instance was minor alone, together unmistakable. He compiled a summary, factual and restrained, and prepared it for submission through protected channels designed for matters of internal risk. Before transmitting, he encountered a senior official in the corridor, who remarked casually on the thoroughness of recent audits. The comment was neutral, but the timing felt deliberate. The guard acknowledged it without reaction, completing the upload later that night. He understood that from this point forward, the matter could no longer be framed as uncertainty. The response arrived within hours, not from his immediate chain of command, but from an oversight office rarely invoked. He was instructed to attend a closed session the following morning, bringing all supporting documentation. The meeting room was windowless, its table polished to a dull sheen, the air cool and still. Those present asked few questions, focusing instead on verification. They examined the footage, reviewed the logs, read the medical findings in silence. When discussion came, it centered on process rather than outcome, on jurisdiction and responsibility. The guard answered succinctly, offering no recommendations.
He noted the careful neutrality of the exchange, the absence of denial or defense. When the session concluded, he was dismissed without instruction, left to infer significance from restraint. Returning to his post, he observed a shift in the palace's internal tempo. Access protocols tightened, additional verification layers introduced quietly, without announcement. He learned through indirect channels that the unauthorized badge holder had been placed on immediate leave, the reason undisclosed. No public acknowledgement followed. The child was relocated temporarily to a secured suite, attended by medical staff and guarded continuously. The guard's reassignment was lifted, his presence requested near the new location, framed as routine reinforcement. He accepted the post, aware that proximity now carried responsibility. During a night watch, he encountered the child briefly, escorted past him with minimal ceremony. The child did not look up, but walked steadily, supported by staff. The guard noted the absence of flinching, the slight easing of tension in posture, a detail he recorded mentally, but not on any form. Days later, he was summoned again, this time informed that the findings had been deemed credible and concerning. The language remained careful, but the implications were clear. A formal order was being prepared, one that would require enforcement at a level above his station. He was instructed to stand by. As he returned to his duties, he felt the convergence of protocol and instinct align for the first time since the inspection. The process was slow, constrained by ceremony and law, yet it had moved. The evidence, though circumstantial in isolation, had accumulated into certainty. He understood that the next phase would be visible, and that visibility carried risk for all involved. Standing in the quiet corridor, listening to the subdued sounds of the palace at rest, he recognized that the absence of witnesses had not prevented accountability, only delayed it. The order, when it came, would test not just authority, but resolve, and he prepared himself to execute it without hesitation.
The instruction arrived just before dawn, transmitted through a secure channel reserved for directives that carried legal weight rather than administrative preference. The royal guard read it once, then again, absorbing the phrasing with the same care he had applied to every document since the inspection. A temporary exclusion order had been authorized, effective immediately, limited in scope yet explicit in its terms. The subject was to be informed, escorted from designated areas, and barred from unsupervised proximity to the child pending formal review. The guard noted the balance in the language, decisive without accusation, procedural without spectacle. He acknowledged receipt and prepared. The palace at that hour was subdued, corridors lit at half strength, staff moving with the efficiency of habit rather than urgency. He assembled a small detail, selecting officers known for discretion rather than rank. No explanations were offered beyond assignment parameters. They moved through service passages toward a private suite, footsteps softened by carpet runners, radios silent. Outside the door, the guard paused, listening to the muted sounds within, measuring the moment. He knocked once, firmly, announcing presence and authority without emphasis. The door opened after a brief delay. The exchange that followed was controlled, voices low, formalities observed. The guard delivered the order verbatim, his tone even, eyes steady. There was no argument, only a brief request for clarification, which he provided by restating the terms. The subject complied, gathering personal items under observation. The escort proceeded through predetermined routes, avoiding public corridors, the palace absorbing the movement without reaction. Along the way, the guard noted the subtle shifts in atmosphere, doors closing a beat earlier than usual, staff averting their gaze, the unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed. When the transfer concluded, he documented the execution precisely, timestamps aligned, witnesses recorded. The order had been carried out without incident, yet the weight of it lingered.
Returning to the secured suite, he confirmed that protective measures around the child remained intact. Additional medical staff were present, security layers reinforced quietly. He stood watch as the morning light crept through high windows, illuminating dust motes and the polished edge of a console. The palace would present continuity to the outside world, schedules intact, appearances maintained. Internally, however, the guard recognized a recalibration underway, subtle but consequential. He felt no satisfaction, only the steady resolve that came from acting within the narrow space where duty and restraint overlapped. The order was not an end, but a boundary, and boundaries required maintenance. Maintenance began immediately. Over the following days, the Royal Guard oversaw adjustments that appeared incremental, but together formed a protective lattice around the child. Access lists were revised, verification protocols tightened, escorts standardized. Each change was logged, justified, and implemented without commentary. He attended briefings where language remained measured, the focus on compliance rather than cause. Questions from staff were answered with procedure. The child's routine stabilized, movements predictable, environments controlled for temperature and light. The guard observed from a respectful distance, noting improvements without attributing them to any single action. Pressure arrived in quieter forms. Inquiries from senior offices requested clarification on scope, on duration, on precedent. He responded with references to authorization and statute, keeping his answers narrow. There were reminders, too, about institutional harmony, about the importance of minimizing disruption. He acknowledged them, understanding that harmony often depended on containment. The review process advanced methodically, evidence weighed by committees whose deliberations were sealed. The unauthorized access findings were incorporated, corroborated by independent audit. The medical assessment was reaffirmed. No witnesses emerged, yet the documentation stood. When asked for testimony, the guard provided it without embellishment, recounting sequence and observation, resisting interpretation. He sensed the strain this imposed on those accustomed to deference, but no one challenged the facts. One evening, as he stood in the corridor outside the secured suite, the child passed him on the way to a scheduled appointment, accompanied by staff. There was no flinch this time, only a brief pause as the child adjusted pace, then continued. The guard did not record the moment, but he allowed it to register. Weeks later, a notice circulated internally, confirming the continuation of the exclusion order and the initiation of external oversight. The language was definitive. The guard acknowledged it and returned to his post. The palace adapted, as it always did, absorbing the change into its routines. For the guard, the conflict that had begun with a door ajar resolved into a sustained vigilance rather than a single decisive act. Protocol had been tested and held, not by rigidity, but by accumulation of care. Standing in the steady light of the corridor, listening to the controlled quiet of a functioning institution, he understood that protection was rarely dramatic. It was the persistence of attention, the refusal to look away, and the willingness to carry consequence without display.